Hi, I'm Doug Patterson. This is the fourth in a series, what's becoming a series of dialogues that I'd like to have with the people of the United States, basically. And the other three are available also on YouTube, and they kind of progress one to the other, even though in each presentation I do want to summarize previous thoughts. And today there are sort of three parts I want to cover. The first is I really want to cover the crisis in Ukraine. I mean, it's such a monumental moment for the United States and Ukraine and Russia. I want to bring some thoughts to that. And second, I want to talk just so briefly, something I mentioned in the third presentation about the origin of the human mind. What is characteristic of that that we all have, the humans have? Is the origin of the mind. And finally, the main topic for today is the rule of the world by the bourgeoisie. Who is the bourgeoisie, and what is it they have to do with the current manifestation of fascism on the planet? And if you've heard some of my earlier stuff, I present a lot of material about fascism, and I put some ideas forth about what it is. So those are the topics of today. And I welcome you to listen to them, and I also would like you to respond. If you can send me an email or a text or whatever, I'd like to know your thoughts. The first presentation today is on the crisis in Ukraine, and the main point I want to make about the crisis in Ukraine is something that has been erased from United States media and policy history. And that is the change of government in Ukraine in February 2014 during an event which is called the Maidan, Revolution, the Democratic Revolution. And what is left out of history is what clearly happened in February of 2014 in Ukraine is a coup, a well-planned and executed effort through many different tactics of throwing out the elected government of Ukraine and installing a new coup government approved by the West and approved by the United States. Because my contention is that this was a CIA organized coup by the United States and all of our resources. And that's not talked about anymore. So it seems to me that any of the discussions about the current catastrophe in Ukraine needs to go back to February of 2014 and acknowledge that the United States was deeply involved in the coup and the change of government, that an elected leader, even though Viktor Yanukovych was a horrible leader, a terrible president, he was elected, and the United States put together forces, right-wing forces, very reactionary forces, and some people said some of it was sort of fascist forces, which I think are true. And with the removal of Yanukovych in a relatively short time, the active coup was about a week. The government that was established was a very right-wing government, and it reached out immediately to the organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, the deposed president, Yanukovych, was, in a sense, with requirements from Putin in Moscow, required to deny any kind of appeal to NATO or appeal for membership in NATO. And yet, when Yanukovych was gone, one of the first things that happened was the new so-called government asking for membership in NATO. So all of this was an incredible shock, surprise, and embarrassing and terrifying for Vladimir Putin. Because NATO, since the collapse of the Soviet Union around 1990, had slowly been acquiring membership in NATO. The East German state, of course, and Poland, and so the Czech Republic, and Bulgaria, and Romania, had all sort of become NATO. And NATO was designed specifically not only to check the Soviet Union and then Russia, but to, I suggest, diminish its powers and make it as a state more accessible to United States corporate exploitation. And in fact, the number of corporations that sailed into Russia after the decline of the Soviet state is really astonishing. They really went in like the predators they are. So with this new development, with a new right-wing government in Ukraine, openly hostile to Russia, reaching out to NATO, Vladimir Putin went to work. What he did was, first of all, to assemble a plan to torpedo the campaign of Hillary Clinton for president. And this was 2014, so he had 2 years to put this all together, and within a year, it's already happening. And it would culminate in 2016 with her astonishing email scandal and the connection to Russia and who was communicating with who. That was all orchestrated by Putin and by Russia, and it was kind of sloppy, but it was sufficient to just cost her enough votes that she lost the presidency. And I think Putin was very happy. In fact, I think Putin thought that she was part of the plan for the coup. So these are observations I'm going to make. I think all of the information about the coup itself is documentable. There's articles on it recently. I've been reading some material at the time, in February 2014, that are explicitly outlining precisely what happened with the United States engineering that coup. So with the so-called new government in Kyiv, Vladimir Putin went to work to take the Ukraine under his own control, and that is what has happened. And it's happened because of the coup. I think we can honestly say that. Moreover, I think we can say that the encroachment of NATO to the east, which they had promised not to do in 1991, the West promised that, and NATO promised that, and then went ahead and began to get more membership in the West-oriented NATO organization, created a situation where I think Putin felt he just had to take move. He had to take measures. One of the things we must remember is that there is a 1,400-mile border of Ukraine with Russia. 1,400 miles, enormous. And I would suggest to you that if Ukraine had become a NATO state, which probably won't now, but if Ukraine had become a NATO state, there would be U.S. military installations all along the border of Russia in Ukraine within, what do you get 2 years, 1 year, 5 months, 5 days. The United States policy and military is imperial, it's aggressive, it's violent, and I think it would probably have put that kind of military command in Ukraine to threaten Russia, to provoke Russia, create provocations, and then create permanent chaos on that border. So that's my first thought for the day. It's about Ukraine. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about the role of the United States and the CIA in changing governments all over the world. And here was one change that, in a sense, was one of the central prizes of the CIA for the last century, ever since Lenin. The CIA has wanted to change governments in Russia, and there was a great step for it. So that's the first presentation. Is about Ukraine. Second, very briefly, I mentioned this. This is kind of disconnected. This isn't all going in the same direction, but I hope you'll allow me this. I've been thinking one of the concerns I have about fascism is its entrenchment of supremacy, and I think that is one of the core features of fascism. Is not a sense of very differences being able to work together, but rather there are supremacies that are designated by a state and by fascists individually designating supremacies. And one of the great supremacies that has been a problem for the world, and certainly the West, for 6,000 years is male supremacy. I think the patriarchy comes in with the establishment of civilization. I'll try to review that in a second. Yet, one of the things that is said about the human being, the human consciousness evolving, is, maybe 1,000,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, is the ability of humans to use tools. And I've been thinking about that the last couple of years, and one of the things you think about tools is male and sort of the tool shed or the tool shelf out in the garage. Tools, it is a decidedly male way of looking at humans participating in the world. And we shouldn't be surprised, because these theories have evolved, in sort of academic and political circles in the last, 200 years, 300 years as written down. But patriarchy is coming into place 6,000 years ago. And one of the things I like to suggest is that there is a need for the human to understand itself in terms of something that it can identify, and it can name. So we talk about tools as something you work with, make things with. Well, I would say that way prior to tool use is the activity of women. And women as the bearers of children discover very early on breath. The breath becomes more than just staying alive with whatever it was that was keeping humans alive by breathing, but breath becomes a tool by which birth is facilitated. Breath is manipulated. I imagine that in early human groupings, that women participated with women in the birth process. And one of the things that happens is women encouraging breathing, and women discovering breathing as an element of the human anatomy that can be changed and altered. And that's what we know today, is that one of the things we can affect is very basic to us, is breath. It's we can have a little effect on the heart, we can have a little effect on our digestion, we can do things to affect that, but breath we have a lot of control over. And in fact, as we get to some of the great spiritual practices of the East, and yoga, and Kundalini yoga, breath becomes a central feature of how we heal ourselves, how we prepare ourselves for a better and better life. So I would like to assign that emergence of sort of human identification of tool as coming from women, and that women were then able to take that kind of identification of breath and be able to use something into work with hands and fingers, and probably at the same time the men were doing it, but it would be women who have a sense of being able to change and adjust the world in order to live in it better. So there's a thought I'd like to throw out, kind of countered some of the male supremacy, of which I, of course, in part. I inherited it, and I've been trying to shed it for decades. So the third part of our talk today is about, it's like a warning. And it's a warning for us to understand, what is the bourgeoisie? What is this class? And I use the term, it's sort of a classic, European 17th, 18th, 19th century word. The bourgeoisie actually referred to itself as a bourgeoisie, certainly early on. They don't do that as much anymore. But The bourgeoisie is our current holder, and manipulator, and creator of fascism. Why do I say that? Well, my contention is, I've said this before, is that for 50,000 years at least, the human family was tribal. We lived in small to moderately sized groups. We're not very large. We're mainly hunter-gatherers. A few got developed agricultural processes, but as far as we know so far, it's fairly few. But the hunter-gatherer was very effective and able to protect the people, and in order to feed the people, in order to even house the people, create tools, make things that would work, use fire. And this organization of the human family over millennia and millennia was successful in promoting the presence of the human being on the planet, and in fact populating it from moving out of Africa. That's the common phrase, out of Africa, although we can also say out of and back into and out of again. I think there's probably that migration that happened out of Africa into the Middle East and then back again a number of times, with many different kinds of people, and moving to populate the entire planet. The entire planet is what the tribal families did, the tribal groups. All of Asia, all of South Asia, all of the Pacific Island areas, around Indonesia, all of Australia, all of Europe, Greenland, Iceland, and then finally with the arrival of the Bering Strait access during the ice ages, people moved down across the Bering Strait and down into what became the Americas. I don't like to use the word Americas because that's has so many names enforced from European colonialism. But those North and South, land masses occupied entirely by tribal people. But something happened about 6,000 years ago, 4,000 before the Common Era, in what is called Sumeria. And my story is that, at some point there, people discovered bricks. And they could put one brick next to another and put some mortar in between. And with enough bricks, you could build a wall. And you could build a fortification, safety, protection from the weather, the wind, enemies, whatever. But tribal people then had this transition for a number of centuries into small villages that had walls and architecture. And so the ability for people to live not only by 10 or 15 or 100 or 200 people together, but several thousand people could live together in villages and increasingly in cities. And one of the things we have with the emergence of cities is male patriarchy. Most of the global families and tribes were matriarchal. The sense of continuing the culture went through the woman. And even a sense of the feminine values were those values that the tribe really valued the most. But with 4,000 years ago and living in cities, suddenly men were on top, literally and figuratively. And it was done with force. Certainly we think that men did things by force, protecting the village, protecting the town, protecting the city. Men become sort of industrial warriors into armies, and villages and cities begin to compete with each other for resources. Supremacies are declared, such as religion. One religion is superior to another. We have these religious wars, or even interpretation of one religion. And so we have male patriarchy and religious patriarchy occurring very quickly. Cultural supremacy is also coming in, language supremacy. And the battles begin to be very intense. And as a sort of a cliche, it is said that with civilization, this is the beginning of civilization, we get war. That war was simply not a thing that was known in tribal communities. There were skirmishes and there were differences and there was probably conflict and violence. But with civilization, we get war. And what we also get is enslavement. Most probably in tribal communities, there was some form of enslavement from time to time. But with civilization, so quickly we get industrial level enslavement of people. And as cities form and get larger, it's important to be able to have people out in the what we now call rural areas, or they're not city areas, making food and creating food, and bringing the food into the city. Cities need to be fed. You'll probably note that New York would not last, a week if it weren't for thousands of trucks bringing in food into the city of New York. Same thing happening 6,000 years ago. Agriculture became essential to be able to sustain a city. And there were a need for workers to do that. And the use of enslaved people to create food and then also to serve ruling families and to serve in various functions in a city became common. So it's with civilization that we get literally fascism, which for me is the state declaration of supremacies, males, culture, military power, enslavement, and you declare those supremacies, and they're put in place through force and violence, and they're maintained with the force and violence. And for me, that's the key definition of what fascism is. So that from 4,000 years ago, we go through, and this is for another presentation, but we go through like 4 stages of fascism, 4 stages of the declaration and establishment of supremacies in various cities, almost always cities. It's the city-state becomes the center for this, and then eventually the nation. But the declaration of supremacies and the establishment of these supremacies through force and violence, and especially the maintenance of supremacies through force and violence. And so at 6,000 years old, we go from the early stages of the ancient world of Sumeria and Babylon, and then we have Egypt. I'm really moving through millennia here very quickly, up to the period of Greece, and we hail Greece as the great democracy, and it's as much a democracy as the United States is, and not more and not less. The supremacies were male; women were absolutely invisible in the Greek society for the most part. We have enslavement. There in Athens, the great democratic center. There were probably 3 times as many slaves as there were Greek population. And we have the increasing of war and colonialism and conquest, which goes both ways from Greece over to the Middle East and Middle East back to Greece. But it is a fascist state that's ruled by Greek men with power and military force. And cultural supremacy. Greeks saw themselves as really quite superior to a lot of other people. This is transferred over to Rome. Rome is the great sort of fascist power from a couple hundred years before the Common Era up until 400 years. 600 or 700 years of Roman fascism, certainly male supremacist, certainly supremacist of its own religion. Certainly military, the Roman legions, Roman army was devastatingly powerful this whole time. Colonialism, the conquering of people, massive use of slavery. and the things they did to support that. Remember what we're talking about in our universities is that the Romans who established this great culture and they established laws, great for laws. Well, laws are going to become really important by the time you get to the bourgeoisie, because you can't have bourgeois capitalist economies without a lot of laws. And as I say to people who say it's a country of law, I say, whose law? Whose law is it? So with Rome, we have not only the establishment of a kind of a long-term fascist state, but also the modeling of that state capable later on. And certainly we know as Rome fell and the Middle Ages take over, there is a fair amount of fascination with what was Rome and the few writings people could find, and they can find enormous amounts of architecture about Rome. And people were wondering what that was like because it just sort of disappeared, and people would go there to wonder what was that. And as we move through the Middle Ages, which I suggest too was the establishment of fascist states and the church, the male-dominated church, and its incredible involvement with the emerging nation state of France and of Spain and of England. We're getting up to our current time of the so-called modern period, which I suggest, and this is my just predilection, is that there are many revolutions that are happening. Many revolutions happening from the Revolution of 1642 in England to 1660, when the king is removed from office, sort of like Yanukovych. King is removed from office and executed in England. From 1642 to 1660, we have the Puritans in charge, and Oliver Cromwell, he's clearly a fascist ruler, the supremacy of England over everything else, especially over Ireland, and the terror inflicted by the Puritan bourgeois regime, our first European bourgeois regime, over Ireland is unforgivable. It's unforgivable what was done to Ireland. But it was the first emergence of the bourgeoisie, and so we should pay attention to that. That this is a pretty nasty structure of people. And so we have that revolution, and then of course we have the revolutions of the latter part of the 18th century. But by the time we get to about 1750, the bourgeoisie is pretty much tied up. Most of the structural power of Europe, and bourgeoisie is in charge, which means the merchant class. These are no longer aristocrats, kings and queens. They have been thrown out for the sake of merchants and traders. We have to remember the first big corporations were 1602 is the Dutch East India Company. About the same time is the British Hudson Bay Company. And these are the first corporations. We have indications that sort of corporations scattered all the way back into even pre-Greek times. But the corporation becomes a real feature of economic organization from 1602 on. The Dutch East India Company becomes just dominant by the time it gets to 1700. It is given monopoly power. It is a military power. It's an occupational power. It's a colonial power. It's a trading power. And it's given permission to do these things by the state. The state gives it this, so passing on its own fascist power to the corporation. And then as we get to 1750 and 1800, corporations really begin to proliferate as forms of private control of production and private control of wealth that is all inscribed in law. And as I want to tell people, that most of the law that the United States Congress is dealing with and the state is dealing with is property law. Most of it's property, and it's private property, or distinguishing between private and public property. And one of my concerns, this by the way is Magic. This is Magic the cat, and Magic agrees with everything I'm saying. So Magic he does a lot of research for me, or does he correct my research? So anyway, yeah, sweetie, you're a wonderful cat, and so what I'm saying is what we have in charge now since 1750 into 1800. a slave-owning culture, a culture that was engaged extensively in slave trade in England and in France and in Portugal for sure, in the Netherlands, a sense of such supremacy that the landing of Columbus in the Caribbean area, probably on Haiti and Dominican Republic, immediately enslaving people, immediately conceiving himself and his sailors as superior to this tribe, and that was our cat knocking our camera around. You see, he's a little fascist. No, it's not true. No, not true. Not true. We're joking here. The first presence of Europe in the ancient world of the Americas, asserting a kind of supremacy that would be set the model for what would happen in the next 400 years. Immediately, Columbus took slaves of the indigenous Taino people. Immediately, he claimed this land for Spain and Italy, and for God, for his God, seeing, of course, the indigenous spiritualities as massively inferior and pagan. Speaking of pagan, our little black cat is destabilizing the world, or my world.
The tripod.
That's the anti-tripod movement. So anyway, I'm just having fun here. We're going to put all this up. We're not going to take any of this out, are we?
I don't know.
By the way, that's over there. I should say, as credits, my dear wife, Margie, is the person who's helping to put together all these things. Here she is with the little disruptor.
I'm also the cat wrangler.
The cat wrangler, the little kitty who keeps us all humble.
Yeah.
Is that true? Okay.
Magic just wants to say he wants world peace.
Well, good. Or he owns a piece of the world.
Yeah.
That's what it's really. And then Mike is right here. Mike. Oh my gosh, Mike. Burns. Thank you. I was going to say Burke because I know Mike Burke. Oh my God, that goes back 50 years.
It's okay. I don't have to be in it.
You're not in it, but his voice is here.
I am here. I am with you.
because in a sense, I mean, we all know this. It's important in all these productions to say that there are other people besides the so-called talent sitting here. There's an entire crew. Our crew is 200% larger than the talent. So now we have digressed onto that. How do we get from Columbus to that? I don't know. We discovered new lands, and so it just sets the model because enslaved people become one of the first huge commodities for capitalist trade. It's with the shipping and the use of human beings that the capitalist structures of the West are able to build phenomenal amounts of wealth. Not in this sort of feudal system of land control, but of the capitalist system of wealth and capital control. And bourgeoisie understand capital from very early on. And they make use of their understanding to dominate their worlds. And capitalism goes through any number of struggles and crises and battles in order to have the most supreme. But certainly by the time we get to 1750 and 1800, the bourgeoisie is entirely in charge. It declares its supremacy of its languages and of its nationality, of its religions, always patriarchy. And almost always, now that we're in Europe, almost always white. White becomes dominant, certainly over color and black. And this is one of my concerns. It is this particular class of the bourgeoisie that now, because of the recent, 30 years ago, globalization, because the socialist world shrank precipitously at that time as both Russia and China moved toward capitalist cultures. It is the capitalist structure that rules the world, and its concomitant class is the bourgeoisie, which I suggest is a fascist class, and is a structure been put together by the bourgeoisie over 300 years, and by participating in it, by being a CEO or a COO or a lesser administrator or a manager in some way, or even the workers, of course, is going to be one of fascist supremacist control that we call fascism. So this is what we're dealing with, is a world of fascism that is bourgeois, corporate dominated, and to be understood and to be reckoned with. I was about to say feared, but I don't want anybody to be afraid. I want people to feel that we have the power to change lives, to change structures. So these are my concerns about the bourgeoisie. What we see about the bourgeoisie from very early on is that it's racist. The bourgeoisie has been racist globally since it began. It has made accommodations to Arab people, obviously in Saudi Arabia, or to East Indian people who are not white, to Asian people of various kinds. These accommodations have been made, but it has been led by a very racist, unforgiving Western bourgeoisie, and especially in the United States. It's also misogynist. It is not a proponent of women. It puts forth window dressing, but to this day, one of the things that I grew up as a theater practitioner, a theater student, and faculty member eventually, is that people did women, when they got done with rehearsals, we would have rehearsals for theater, both when I was a student and as a faculty member. Women in the cast or in the crew, when they left the theater, went to each other and said, "Who's going out to a car? Anybody need a companion to go out to a car?" That's a misogynist world. If women are not safe anywhere, and especially at night, that's a misogynist world. And the male patriarchal bourgeoisie has done nothing to remedy that. That's one of the features of the bourgeois world. It isn't going to remedy it. As a sidebar here, one of the things I wanted to say is that if you look at the list of, I'm here in Omaha, Nebraska. And when I got here to Omaha in 1981, I was reminded that Warren Buffett lived just a few blocks away. Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha. And that he was one of 5 billionaires in the world and the United States. And we should all just go, ooh, at that. Well, the ooh of Warren Buffett has turned into kind of a fetishizing in the bourgeois culture of becoming a billionaire. We have sort of been enamored of Warren Buffett, collecting this massive amount of wealth. I think, what's it, 160 billion now, right now, even though he's not on the top. He is in that top group. But becoming a billionaire has become a fascist sort of enterprise of the corporate bourgeoisie. And if you look at the Fortune 500, that's Fortune magazine's 400 richest people, except for maybe a dozen, it's all women, it's all men. And except for maybe a dozen, it's all white. And this is the culture of the bourgeoisie, and it's not going to change. It's not going to change. The wealth and the structures of wealth have been put in place, and they're not there for you and me. And so if one is on the side of justice, we have to interrogate this structure seriously, because in a very real sense, the corporate state is the government. So when you hear various right-wingers say, "I hate the government," I want to remind them that the corporate state is the government. Do they really hate that? The public government of Washington or the public government of Lincoln do what the corporate state needs to have done. They're the servants of the corporate state. And they clean up. The public agencies clean up after the bourgeoisie and their corporations. So if they make a toxic chemical plant, we develop the Superfund, public money, to go in and clean up the bourgeois mess. This has always been the case. The bourgeoisie does not clean up after itself. It always makes sure that someone, an enslaved person, or a public government, or some public agency cleans up after them. They don't clean up after themselves. They never have, never will. A little more on that in a moment. So I would say that's a couple of things that are indicative of the fascist bourgeoisie, that it's racist, that it's misogynist, that it is enamored with billionaires. It's also isolated. But this is true of the aristocracy too. That's why they lived in castles, get themselves isolated and protected, because they were certainly better than everybody else. But they're hard to find. They make a point out of living in gated communities. And it used to be gated communities were fairly small. Now these gated communities are very large, and they are accessible through one road with police protection and security protection at that road, both in and out. That's where the bourgeoisie lives, and they're hard to find. It's hard to find where their restaurants are, where their shopping areas are. I sometimes wonder, do they even shop, or is that just all done for them? So it's an isolated group, very much like the medieval Renaissance aristocracy. The relentlessly self-consciously a ruling class. They know they rule, and they intend to rule, and nobody's going to stop them, not even elections. So we have elections in the United States that have been developed, which we're very proud to call a democracy, but it's an electoral democracy. A thin electoral democracy. It isn't a real democracy. It's not an economic democracy. That's going to take a big change. But we got elections that happen that the bourgeoisie control. The bourgeoisie contributes to candidates. The corporate structure is very good at contributing to both candidates. And they always say there are both parties. Well, why don't we have 10? No, you got 2. Those are manageable. And the bourgeoisie controls those 2 parties. They're both capitalist, so in a sense, we are what the Soviet Union was. We are a one-party state. We just have 2 wings. The Soviet state had different points of view on how communism should run, so it was a one-party state, and we have a one-party state. It's corporate capitalism. So our political structure is dominated by a very few but extraordinarily rich people and their corporations. Let me add in here that I'm a strong advocate of the word political. I like political. I like politics, but you have to define it. And politics means power. That's what it means, power. It doesn't mean elections, and that's how we've been sort of conned into not liking politics. Because it's elections. Well, I don't blame people for not liking elections, because it certainly limits anything that's going to happen. But politics, I like. Politics is power. People have power. We've heard the current phrase that this activity is going to empower people, and I say, stop that. People have power. People have power. We don't know it, or we don't understand it, or we don't use it. But nobody's going to come from the outside and empower anybody. People have power. The question is, can it be understood? Can it be brought to the surface? Can we be conscious of it? And can we use it as part of our critical thinking to improve our lives? So politics is wonderful. It's everywhere. It's power. It's the power of corporations. It's the power of military. There's feminist politics. There's Argentinian politics. There's gay politics. There's rural politics. There's Nebraska, Lincoln, Pete Ricketts politics. There is Russian politics. There's environmental politics. There's all kinds of politics, which means power. How people are trying to organize their power. So let's appreciate and appreciate what knowing about politics can do for us. But the bourgeoisie has convinced us that it's elections. Well, let's use it as much as we can as we struggle for economic democracy, not just political democracy. So the capitalist class puts profit above all. I'm not saying anything anybody's going to be surprised at here. Profit is the motive for everything. You're going to make profit in a business, or you're not going to be the CEO or a manager or even a worker unless you can be part of a profit system. And I consider profit a private tax. So when people say, "Oh, I hate taxes," well, the taxes tends to be what the public government or the public agencies are able to get from the public to do public things like roads and schools and parks, recreation. That's what public does, and the private tax is profit. It's everything left over from when you put in the production costs and labor costs and any of the strange costs and salaries. It's what's left over, and that left over is a private tax on us, and we get taxed a lot. And of course, that ability for profit comes and goes very quickly. Right now, we're living in a period of considerable inflation, which I think has been structured and put into place by the ruling class. They intended this. They want this. During this time of great inflation, they're going to make massive profits, just like what happened in 1975s, 80, when we had the great oil crisis and the containment of oil by the Arab states. The United States corporations, oil corporations, made an extraordinary amount of profit because they could. Phrase goes, never let a crisis go to waste. During times of crisis, you can make a lot of money, a lot of profit, but all it is a private tax, and they raise tax relentlessly. And that's what we're going through right now. We are going to feed a lot of profit into the corporate structure. Another thing is managerialism. The result, the promise of the corporate state is that they aren't going to solve any problems. They're going to manage them. So you don't hear anybody talking about wanting to solve the problem of poverty, or solve the problem of misogyny, or solve the problem of racism. We're just going to manage it, make it manageable. And when it comes to money, if you hear the double entendre, they manage to make it. They manage to make it. Corporate state lead officials don't do any work. They manage. I'll suggest to you that that management is not work. It doesn't produce anything. It might organize things, coordinate things, but it doesn't produce anything. That's for the workers. That's for the people sitting at the computers, on the assembly line, sending out the various insurance claims and payments. It's workers who make things. They don't manage. And under our current system, it's difficult to get by if you just work. But if you manage, you can manage to make it. You can manage to make money. And that is the hallmark of the bourgeoisie, is management of us. In a sense, what I suggest to you is that we are living increasingly in a corporate concentration camp. It's large, it's massive. It seems to be okay, especially if you're getting by, if you're sort of white and male, educated like me. I'm getting by okay. Every now and then it gets a little bit tricky, but no, we're getting by fine. But a lot of people, I suggest that these figures of the poverty in the United States at 15%. I said what that ignores is most of the poor people. So I think poverty is probably about 20% now, and that near poverty, people hanging on by the fingernails, is 30%. So I'd suggest 50% of the United States is living in poverty or near poverty. When people are talking about, hey, people living from week to week, they're not saying they're poor. And I guess we don't say they're poor because they're able to pay their rent to their predatory landlords. But that means that half the population is dealing with poverty. This is the richest nation in the world, they say. That's because of the fact that 400 billionaires control $14 trillion worth of wealth. That's why. Because they lead the bourgeois concentration camp that we're living in. Their messages come through us 24/7, 365. It's the TV commercial, which are some of the most coercive and manipulative features of United States communication. And we have our as my good mentor Augusto Boal said, we have had our real desires removed from us and been replaced with the desires the corporate state wants us to have. Not only for these kinds of foods or clothes or cars, but this look, how you look as a human being, your bearing, your color, your gender, your nationality, your language. These features of sort of corporate approved identity renders us in a stratified concentration camp of privilege and lack of privilege and fighting amongst each other. But on top of it all is a very thin layer of extraordinarily rich, powerful people who control the concentration camp in which the rest of us live. So I want to come to an end of this particular presentation today. I welcome all kinds of criticism and critique. I like that. I look forward to it. You can send an email. I think that'll be up on the screen someplace. Will that be up on the screen, Margie?
Yes, I can do that with the guidance of Michael.
Okay, Michael.
I got you.
Okay, we got that worked out. And even can we put up a phone number or should we do that? Not do that?
I don't care. It's
For a
up to you.
text. For a text.
Well,
They can do whatever they want, I suppose. Call me at 4 a.m.
Well, you might want to like get another phone for that.
Yeah, get a different phone and then
We're thinking of getting a different phone. Okay, see, we've got a few resources, so we're kind of getting by. But I want to warn people that we are in for a real struggle. Oh, and the thing I forgot to say is that the bourgeois class has been at war with the natural world all along, polluting and exploiting and making filth and creating carbon and not taking responsibility for it, making war on the natural world of human beings, of indigenous people since 4,000 years before the Common Era. We have been, as a culture, at war with the tribal world permanently, and we've genocided it off the planet. This is led by the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie has been the lead people to do this. They are genocidal, certainly were in this area, and they have not had any real sense of how to preserve the earth as a place to live. Even there's rumors that the bourgeoisie is, living and building certain kinds of, ships and boats to be able to live in the Pacific and get through all the climate change, put away enough water and caviar they can make it to the end. This is a predatory culture. This is not a good group of people to be ruling. It's a structural thing. I don't hate people. I don't hate Donald Trump. I know that seems like a contradiction, but I don't hate Donald Trump. I hate what he says and what he does. I don't hate the bourgeoisie. I don't know I don't know any of these people. I don't hate them as human beings. I hate them for what they do and what they say, especially what they do and what they don't do. So I'm going to wrap this thing up. Keep trying to wrap it up. I should bring the cat in to help. But
I can shake the camera.
You can shake the camera. Now the world is going back to normal. Yay. So we'd love to have you contact me for comments. This is the fourth in the series. There'll be another one. I appreciate you listening. Give me a shout out, and we'll talk more about so many topics. Thanks so much. Talk to you next time.
Right on. Keep the camera rolling. I want to get a photo. Keep it recording.
Oh, it's going.
Okay. Good job.
You want to do it from here? Yeah, we are. See how good we look. See how good she looks.
I'm so proud of you, Coda.
I just sit down and talk.
The socialists get all the women.
I got
all the hotties.
I got the finest.
This is definitely going in. We need a little humor, right?
Yeah.
So how long did it go? How long?
About an hour.
About an hour. Ah. Well, I knew it was getting long. I knew that. I usually do about 30, 40 minutes, but I had a lot of topics I wanted to cover.
Interesting question, real quick, and I don't want to go it too long.
Anything at all.
So do you think that what I find interesting about human beings is that many human beings lack self-awareness for where they're at, for what's going on around them, and even for themselves. Do you think
Can
that
you turn this off?
Oh, do you want it on or off?
Oh, do you need any more?
Oh, no.
Are we this is part of it?
It could be if
Oh,
you'd
let's
like.
do it. Let's do it.
It's
Let's do
gonna
it.
be nice to have other stuff in it.
I mean,
Let's do it. Let's do
Yeah.
it.
So I get my question is: do you think?
So this
that,
is Mike. This is Mike. Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
Do you think that the bourgeoisie, like you said, they don't know what they do, and they don't know that their actions have repercussions, and that it leads to a lack of self-awareness, and if they were more self-aware, it could promote a lot more general well-being? Or is it an actual malicious act on behalf of this entire class of people?
Well, I would see it as a malicious act, but they wouldn't. Again, what I'm trying to talk about here, I'm arguing for fascism. And fascism does have, I think, the capacity to simply render human beings as non-entities. The fourth level of fascism, I think, go from one early primitive to the second level is the city-states, England, Greece, Rome, to the Renaissance fascism and the incredible amount of wars, privilege, hierarchy, and enslavement. And then finally, Nazi. The Nazi is the fourth level of fascism, and it's the worst. By far the worst. They took it where Rome couldn't imagine. Just a horrific manifestation of the fourth level of fascism. But we're living in the third level. We're permanently now in the third level, which I think is very intense, very organized. Now, the people, once you're in fascism, then you can, the structure allows you simply to dismiss massive numbers of people as irrelevant or as a feature of your privilege that you make money off of. Why is it that corporations and Amazon resist union, bust union, in really predatory, aggressive, violent ways? They stop unions. Why? Well, it interferes with their profits. It interferes with their ability to do what a corporation is mandated to do, is make profits for the stockholders. That's one of the things that's written into law. That's what it does. So since you have profits, private property, as a core feature of the structure, then you can dismiss people who are getting in the way of that as getting in the way of what God intended, or what the state intended, or what natural law. This is what human beings are, grand totalizations about what human beings are. And I think, once you're in a position of privilege, you can say, Jews are just not human.
Yeah.
And that really sold. And that had millennia of support and mythologies. But by the time you get to the 20th century, that's a common thing that Jews are the plague of the nation and plague of the world. And the way in which the Germans were able to extinguish so many people, it had to be because they just simply weren't. They had no human characteristics whatsoever. They were animals. So yeah, I think the corporate state just has a structure that requires that way of looking at things.
Gotcha.
The supremacy of the billionaire.
And invertedly, it almost wants you to think that way, which is why in our education system we really don't. The critical skills seem to be almost non-existent.
Yeah, they were much more active back in the 50s and 60s post-war. I grew up in a much more critical environment. That's how you got the 60s.
Right.
People say, "What the fuck is this?"
The early states, so we're not doing that again.
And the bourgeoisie is just waiting for me to deny it.
But it ain't gonna happen for another 80 years.
I'm one of the oldest of the baby boomers because I was born in October of 45, and the official start date is January 1st of 46. But I'm in the graduation class of 1964, which is the first graduation class of the baby boomers, and the corporate state really is eager for my group to start marching off the cliff. They would like us to go away. But now they've got a whole bunch of people in their 20s and 30s
Yeah.
Yeah.
who have been in situations where they go, what the fuck? Just like we did. So, which is, they can't control it. It's a great Marxist principle, is these contradictions. When you have this massive inequality, the contradictions just keep cropping up. It's like earthquakes, except they happen every couple of weeks. They just keep happening.
Right. And how do we promote change without, because it's, everything is we always seem to be in a state of catatonic fear. And I'm sure that's by design.
By design, for sure.
How do we promote massive change, or change it at all in the system without the cost of human life, still promoting the most happiness and well-being of everyone?
I think it's going to take struggle. See, one of the things that you mention here is you're a white man with privilege. You don't want any violence. Poverty is violence. You've got 50% of the population living amidst violence every day.
That's true.
And so when we say we don't want any violence, say, oh, okay, that's easy for you to say.
Right.
So there's going to be some violence, and it's going to be led by the oppressed. It's not going to be led by me. I mean, unless they're really hard up. Yeah,
that's a very good point.
So there's going to be some violence. It's one of the things that Lenin was so good at. What he said is, look, we've seen the revolutions of the bourgeoisie starting in the 17th century, and these revolutions last like 330 years, 100 years. These wars take forever. He said, when we have revolutions of of socialism, we want them to happen fairly quickly. That's why we want to understand them. Lenin was such a scientist, so was Marx. What is happening here? How can we make it happen fairly quickly if we understand the situation? Well, then I would suggest people, and I'll say this into the camera, even if it is running, you have to study Lenin, not what he knew, because what he knew was in 1900 and 1910, which is very limited use for today. But we have to see the way in which his approach is to understand the situation in terms of class and the various fissures of the dominance control. We are going to be handed, in the next 20, 30 years, a huge ongoing contradiction of climate change. We're going to be handed a huge contradiction. I think that we didn't mean it, but it's an opportunity to make extraordinary changes in the planet, in which we value the planet. We value all the creatures on the planet. In fact, we value all the human beings, but we don't value all of the human structures.